The first thing I'm going to start out with is a contra Whig theory of history. Whig theory of history really begins in the early or mid-19th century, and it's sort of taken over, and it's still with us. As a matter of fact, it's still dominant, despite criticisms in the 30s and 40s. Basically, what the Whig theory of history says that history is an inevitable march upward into the light. In other words, step by step, the world always progresses, and that this progress is inevitable. Now, the Whigs themselves are kind of lovable. They were moderate classical liberals, I guess, in favor of... And when they coined the theory in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, there was a certain amount of justification for it, in the sense that, indeed, if they look back on the past, things seem to be always getting better and better. There's an increase in freedom, an increase in civilization, and standards of living, and science, and knowledge, and so forth and so on. And so they unfortunately made this impressionistic conclusion into a doctrine, and saying that all this is inevitable. If this is 1870, we're always better off in every way than 1860, etc., etc. This implies heavily that everything that was at any stage of the game was right, or was the best possible at the time, and therefore anything that is now is right, or at least is the best possible for this epoch. So this is essentially determinist and inevitability, and also puts a stamp of approval on everything in the past and present. Really it amounts to, because it says things like, well, slavery was bad, of course, but slavery, of course, now is bad from our perspective. But slavery in the old days was good because it was better than whatever the pre-slavery thing was. Now, of course, they had a problem in the Dark Ages, where everybody admits things got worse from about the 5th to the 10th century A.D., after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But they sort of say, wow, that was one glitch, non-repeatable glitch in the onward and upward march of progress. So what we have now that looking at it from the perspective of 1986, the idea that everything is always getting better is much shakier, obviously. I mean, the 20th century is in many ways a century of genocide. But still in all, the Whig theory of history is flourishing, and it's gotten even more hard-nosed, so to speak, more locked in. And we see this, for example, getting to economics, we see this, unfortunately, among what we can call the Friedmanite or Buchananite theory of history. Everything in the past, first of all, the analysis of history is very cryptic. Economists in dealing with history usually, in these days, for example, the North Thomas book on the economic history of Europe covers, 600 years and about a few equations. Sort of, condenses everything in a couple of equations. And this is explicitly Whig to the core. Not only that, the idea is that anything that existed must have had a good function, was good to have existed because it had formed an important function. Now, for example, in sociology, the famous the Parsonian view of sociology, which is looking at all society, social systems, whatever, everything's got a function, everything fits in. Well, I suppose you can look at things that are having a function. I mean, I guess the slave master had a certain function, but the point is, was it a good function? And that's never asked, you see, because it's assumed that whatever existed should have existed. Ethics is not really mentioned, but it's really implicitly derived from the fact that it existed, and it existed for a certain period of time. It's sort of like an existence theory of ethics. But if it lasted for a while, it must have been okay. The fact that murder has lasted for a long time, since the beginning of mankind, theft, slavery, etc., doesn't necessarily make it good, of course. It doesn't make it even functional. Or we can look at it this way: function from whose perspective? From the perspective of the robber or the robbed. At any rate, this Whig theory of history permeates economic history in particular. The worst example I know of is kind of an interesting example. Eckelund and Tollison, two distinguished public choicers of Buchananites, have written a book called Mercantilism as a Rent-Seeking Society. Now, they don't pretend, it's a short book, they don't pretend to do any historical research at all, and they admit it. I mean, they're upfront about that. They take Heckscher's great book on mercantilism and simply engage in exegesis of it. Heckscher is magnificent. He wrote this book about 80 years ago. There have been some advances since then, but that's a criticism. We don't have to deal with that. What I'm interested in more is the Eckelund-Tollison method of analyzing stuff. They say that mercantilism is essentially a theory of mercantilism. An ideology is a rationale for seeking monopoly privileges on the part of the merchants and the bureaucrats, etc., etc. And I agree with that, except for the fact they use the word rent-seeking, which I'm extremely critical of. And this is something I hope to get back to later on, but It derives from the Ricardian theory of rent, which is still extant, is still permeating, and still, unfortunately, dominant, based on the idea that rent is a differential, which can be easily taxed away, since it's a surplus, a non-productive surplus, so to speak, and therefore can be taxed. It's like saying that if Dustin Hoffman is making $2 million a year and Joe Zilch, another actor, is making $10,000 a year, the difference is differential, and Hoffman's $999,000 or whatever can be taxed away without decreasing his or our and his productivity or our enjoyment of it. But the important thing is when they get to, here they are, they say they interpret, according to the Buchananites and Stiegler, that's what we call who now believes that, even though he's an historian of economic thought, believes that economic theory has had no influence whatsoever on events, economic events, none whatsoever. This is a behaviorist interpretation. Ideas have no influence on history at all. It's pure economic interest. So interpreting mercantilism works fine with this, but then the Eckel and the Tollison have the question, how did mercantilism disappear? Why did free trade come in? Okay, if everybody's seeking monopoly privilege, you have the usual public choice stuff about how consumers are not interested, and the privileged seekers are always interested. How do they get rid of this? Why isn't it locked in forever? As Stiegler claims, statism is locked in forever now. So searching around for an explanation. Now, the obvious explanation for anybody who thinks that ideas are important is that the free trade movement came in. It's a mass movement consisting of merchants, lower classes, intellectuals, etc., free trade movement which swept the board, a mighty ideological movement which got rid of this web of privilege. Eckel and Tollison can't say that because they think ideology is unimportant. So what they say is, they base it all, this is of course the escape hatch for all Buchananites, for all public choices throughout history. Transaction costs. It's like a talisman. It's like the magic talisman. Anything that happens in history, transaction costs. As if the object of everybody's life is to minimize transaction costs. This is sort of like the main value and everybody's holding in his heart. I really don't care about transaction costs. I mean, the heck with it. But at any rate. So his idea of why free trade and laissez-faire succeeded, replaced mercantilism, is that it became too, now get this, as the king was replaced by Parliament, it became too costly to lobby Parliament. In other words, all these special privileges trying to lobby Parliament. King is just one guy, you lobby him, and it's easy transaction costs are low. To lobby 500 guys in Parliament becomes too expensive. Therefore, they stopped lobbying and they sort of fell back on free trade as faute de mieux, so to speak. Now, any sillier explanation of any historical event, I don't know of. I mean, at least it reaches rock bottom. In the first place, there's no evidence that there's cheaper transaction costs. He seems to assume there's one king, and it's very simple to lobby. There's a whole court. If you have an absolute king, he's got lots of dukes and earls and mistresses and everybody else vying for power. It's probably just as expensive, just as high transaction cost to lobby the king as it was in Parliament. He certainly presents no evidence that it was cheaper. And secondly, of course, it misses the fact that the real point is ideological. The thing which sweeps aside special privilege in history is ideology. Despite the fact that these public choice people claim that ideology is irrational, because you're not devoted to it 24 hours a day. It's only ideology. And yet some people are devoted to ideology, as we know full well right now, with Ayatollah Khomeini, etc. Obviously, the Khomeini movement was not founded on cost-benefit analysis of economic interest. It was founded on deeply felt, passionate ideology, okay, which swept aside only the vested interest. Not that I'm in favor of the results of the Khomeini movement. I'm simply saying that ideology is extremely important in history. And there, by the way, I think Hayek, of course, is far superior and is famous. I think one of the best things Hayek ever wrote was Intellectuals and Socialism, which I commend everybody here. The influence, how ideas are influenced in history. They start out with theoreticians and they permeate down to what he calls second-hand dealers in ideas, and I think it's a very good term, journalists and activists, and they start permeating through the general public. And then if you put it into value, cost-benefit terms, you can say that ideology then becomes a deeply held value on the part of people, superseding even transaction costs. That's something which you're devoted to, you've devoted your life to. Can you imagine anybody devoting their life to minimizing transaction costs? At any rate, by the way, I should also say the Marxists are also, oddly enough, Whig theorists, so they're in a special conflict version. So even though the Marxists don't believe in the step-by-step linear approach upward, it's a dialectic approach upward. It's sort of a zigzag approach. And with the Marxists, too, they fall back on this historicist viewpoint. Slavery in their days, Marx is very anti-slavery now, at least some forms of slavery, not their own. But slavery in the old days was good because it was better than whatever the other thing was. Or serfdom was good because it was better than slavery. So they too have this Whig theory, historicist theory. the revolution becomes inevitable. And by the way, this is why Marxists and Marxisans, the English call it, Marxoids, or semi-Marxists, why they always use the terms progressive and reactionary. I don't know if any of you ever thought about the use of the term. The Marxists, the only, or the highest moral, or the only moral truth is to be in favor of the inevitable revolution. In other words, to be in tune with the inevitable laws of events. And so these guys are progressives. In other words, progressives are people who are in tune with the next phase of the inevitable historical development, like the revolution, proletarian revolution. Reactionaries are those who are opposed to it. In other words, the whole term progressive and reactionary is a term which is used, of course, as an implicitly ethical basis. It's really a question of who's in tune with the coming events and who isn't. Who's in touch with the zeitgeist of the coming zeitgeist and who's not in touch with it. It's the only standard. By the way, Schumpeter pointed out in one of his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, I think his introduction was second edition, he said, Schumpeter claimed that socialism was inevitable, but for very different reasons than Marxists. He claimed basically it was inevitable for one reason, because capitalism breeds intellectuals who subvert it. At any rate, he said, people say that because I think that socialism is inevitable means I'm in favor of it. Quite the contrary. Why can't you look at your boat, say you're in a canoe is leaking, and you think the sinking is inevitable, it doesn't mean you're in favor of it. You try to fight against it and postpone it as long as possible. So at any rate, according to the Marxists, of course, the inevitable means it's the good. Okay, so to conclude about the Whig theory of history, I think the major, deeper, underlying problem is that since people have free will and have freedom to make choices, history is not really determinist. There are no determinist laws of history. And therefore, the Whig theory ignores free choice, it ignores the great moral problem, since free choice involves moral choices. And they don't realize that history is a great moral drama, a drama of advance, of conflicts, of retrogression, of good versus evil, etc., etc. And to wind up with my own doctrine about history, following Albert J. Nock, history is essentially a race or a conflict between state power and social power, as Nock put it. In other words, social power is a network of voluntary interactions of the economy, of civilization, whatever, anything that's voluntarily interacting. He calls social power, and state power, of course, is the state, which is always trying to repress it, cripple it, tax it, loot it, whatever, etc., etc. So history becomes a race between these two forces. Okay, to get down to a subset of this, or an application of this, the Whig theory of the history of science. I'm coming to economics in a minute. Whig theory of the history of science, which is very similar, of course, to the Whig theory of history, period. And the Whig theory of history of science was dominant, probably is still dominant in the high school textbooks, was dominant until the 60s. Essentially said that science, the growth of knowledge, is an onward and upward, step-by-step approach from the year 0 or minus 0 to now. Now, a lot of implications of that. One implication is you don't have to read the history of science unless you're an antiquarian. In other words, if you're a physicist in 1986, there's no point in reading some physicist in 1930 unless you're interested in the special conditions of what happened to him. In other words, you don't learn anything from it. So in other words, you never lose any knowledge. Theory is that at every step of the way, science patiently tests its assumptions, its premises, and discards those which turn out to be unacceptable or false, and adds those which are acceptable. So everybody's always patiently testing their axioms or whatever, and finally keeping advancing. Therefore, we don't lose no loss of knowledge. The current textbook then incorporates all the best of everything from the year 0 to the present. This is the theory, at any rate. Here the famous Kuhn doctrine, I think, comes in very, very neatly. The famous paradigm theory of Thomas Kuhn called the structure scientific revolution, which is, I think it came out in late 60s. He effected a revolution, not late 60s? Earlier? Early 60s. He effected a revolution in history of science. Kuhn has had a lot of flack on his philosophy of science, which he claims he doesn't really have. In other words, I think he's not interesting as a philosopher. He is interesting as a historian and a sociologist of science. In other words, how did science actually develop? And essentially what he says is that instead of this linear step-by-step stuff, first of all, nobody ever tests their basic axioms, ever. And which, of course, is obviously true. Once an axiom or a paradigm, as he put it, a set of basic beliefs is followed, is adopted, and people just apply it to various peripheral matters and puzzles, as he calls it, which come up. And anybody who challenges the basic paradigm is considered not a scientist. It's not that he's refuted or anything, just out of the dialogue. He's had it. And so this pegs on for a while until various anomalies pop up. In other words, until the theory begins obviously not to fail in explaining a lot of stuff. And then there's a crisis situation, as he calls it, where confusion and competing paradigms come up. And if some new paradigm can solve these puzzles better, it then begins to take over and establishes a new paradigm, and they forget all the rest of the stuff. Now, he is alleged to have said that no paradigm is any better than the other. I don't think that's true. But at any rate, the interesting thing of what happens here is that you lose knowledge. Even if this paradigm is better than that, often stuff gets lost along the way. One example is, of course, Greek fire. We didn't know until very recently what Greek fire was. We now know it's like flamethrowers, but we only found that out when we invented flamethrowers. I mean, in 1900, nobody knew what Greek fire had been in ancient Greece. Another example, of course, is the Stradivarius shellac, or whatever it is, which nobody can duplicate. And because you can't test everything, you can't figure out the composition, secret formulas, in other words, which get lost. Well, these are obvious sort of blatant examples. A friend of mine, in history of science, says there are certain laws of 18th century optics which we've forgotten. In other words, we know less in certain areas of optics than they did in the 18th century. But at any rate, when we get to the social science of philosophy, of course, this is much more true. Even, by the way, another thing I should say before leaving this is that the old guys never change, they don't shift to the new paradigms, usually. In other words, the old guys will stick to it until they die. The people who adopt the new paradigms are the younger people, graduate students, college students, who are not intellectually locked into the old paradigm. A famous example of that is Joseph Priestley, the great late 18th century libertarian and physicist, who invented oxygen and refused to believe it was really oxygen. He said, no, he's so locked into the phlogiston theory, he said it's only dephlogisticated air. He refused to acknowledge the implications of his own invention, his own discovery. Incredible. At any rate, so this is very typical. This is why, by the way, strategically, if you're I'm leaping here, if you're an Austrian, you shouldn't spend your time trying to convert Paul Samuelson, let's say, or Milton Friedman. These guys are not going to be converted. They're locked into their paradigm. The people you convert are people who are just coming up, new people on the fence, graduate students. These are people who be converted. You don't waste your time trying to convert Samuelson, or Friedman, or whoever the other paradigm people are. So the war is for the souls of the people coming up, so to speak. Now, obviously, it's pretty clear that in social sciences, economics, philosophy, etc., there's even more of this, because there's less testable stuff, obviously. So that if this is true in science, physical science, which I think it is, it's all the more true in social science, economics, and stuff, where you can really lose knowledge very drastically, because you can replace a good paradigm by a lousy one. Okay? In other words, difficult to do that in physics, probably, if they do it or not, but certainly very easy to do it in philosophy and economics and political thought. It's very easy for a new paradigm to get established for one reason or another. It has nothing to do with its truth value. It could be fashion, it could be politics, it could be the king, it could be throwing all the old paradigm people into the Lubyanka, and whatever. There's all sorts of reasons why. So, in other words, reading history of economics thought, or philosophic thought even more so, is not just an interest for historians to see how theory developed. It's an interest also to find out the truth. Because somebody in 1850 might be better than somebody writing now. As a matter of fact, usually is. In economics, philosophy, and whatever. So the whole history of thought then becomes, in the social sciences and in philosophy, a much more exciting enterprise, seems to me, than in physics. The guiding philosophy in the history of thought, history of economics now, to get into that, the guiding doctrine has been whig again, even though it seems to be obviously untrue. And almost every textbook is a whig text. A hallmark of it would be this. Any group, they talk about whoever they're talking about, any group has something positive to contribute to the building up of economics. Whatever, even though they're totally contradictory. One group is obviously nutty. Doesn't make any difference. They're not nutty. They're part of a great dialogue. Okay, so any group then takes their place. And so whoever you're talking about, French, the Scholastics, the British classicists, the Austrians, the Keynesians, the Institutionalists, they're all great guys. They all somehow contribute to this great edifice. As a result of this, of course, the historian of economic thought who does this is non-controversial, quote-unquote, nice guy, because he likes everybody, right? Tolerant. The fact that he's dead wrong doesn't seem to make that much difference. Undogmatic, and all the other odious things which these people are. It seems to me these things are almost worthless, because it's true that a good historian, even as a Whig approach, can sum up what each group says, or each person says, but that's not really enough, because it seems to me the historian should be critical, should find out, is this guy wrong, or to what extent is he wrong? Is he right? And what's going on here? Especially in economics or philosophy, where it's not just a cut and dry thing where we now have a laser beam before we only had rubbing two sticks together. Well, by the way, probably the worst example of this sort of thing the Leo Straussian doctrine in history of political thought. Leo Strauss was a German refugee, came to the University of Chicago and set up what can only be called a cult group of Straussians, and they're all very self-consciously Straussian. They follow the master in all things, etc., etc. The Straussians take a few what they call great thinkers. I'm going to criticize that too, the concept of taking only great thinkers. They take a few great thinkers, more or less arbitrarily selected. How do they know they're great thinkers? Well, everybody says they're great. Machiavelli, Aristotle, Dewey, whatever. We don't want to talk about Hobbes. And then they say, since this guy is a great thinker, he must have been consistent. Right? Why must he be consistent? Well, he's a great thinker. Who am I, a schnooky professor, to challenge the greatness of this guy? Okay? The assumption is this guy's a great thinker. Now, if he's inconsistent, which most of these guys are very inconsistent, they contradict themselves on every page, and Keynes contradicts himself all the time. There must have, it looks as if he contradicted himself, but he couldn't because he's a great thinker and therefore consistent. So we have to look for the deep inner consistency. The deep inner consistency usually amounts to almost like astrology. It's numerology. Strauss will say, if you take the fifth book of Machiavelli's Prince and compare with the fifth book of the laws, then you get this number magic. You see, you get the 5, and you look for the deep thing which really explains what he's saying, and it's really bizarre. So that's the Whiggism going hog wild. I mean, desperately actually thinks everybody's great, as well as and consistent, as well as contributing to the edifice of thought. So what we have to realize, it seems to me, is that just the opposite. That many thinkers are great, other thinkers are lousy. Some develop truth, others sank into error, and therefore analyzing historians, economists through history, is separating who these guys are. To what extent were they correct? What extent were they bad? What extent did they push economics into a wrong detour, etc., etc. It's true that there's a so-called vice of presentism, where you attack everybody for not having read Human Action. You attack Aquinas for not having read Human Action. It's called presentism. But very few people do that. I think it's a straw man. I don't know if anybody really does that. The real vice is the other way around. The real vice is think everybody is great and everybody's true in some sense. And just to paraphrase one of my favorite quotes from Oscar Wilde, when he says, remember Miss Prism, an importance of being earnest, was asked whether her novel, she had written a 3-volume novel, whether it had a happy ending or not. She drew herself up and she said, the good end happily, the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means. Of course, I would say with Lord Acton that the role of the historian is to praise the good and denounce the bad. That's the meaning of history. Anyway, Acton says the muse of the historian is not Clio, but Rhadamanthus. Clio is the official Greek muse of myth. He said the muse is really Rhadamanthus, the avenger of innocent blood. And he went on to say the historian must be a judge and a hanging judge of that, to right the wrongs of history. Helpfully upward, I talk about in history, this basic methodological or philosophical approach is Skinnerism. I don't mean the evil B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist. I mean Quentin Skinner. Quentin Skinner is a Cambridge political theorist who wrote a magnificent book, which I recommend everybody. It's not libertarian, it's not free market, it's a marvelous book on political thought called The Foundations of Modern Political Thought. The Reformation, the Renaissance and the Reformation. The first volume is on Renaissance thinkers, the humanists, and the second is on the Reformation, Luther, Calvin, etc. And it's just magnificent, because what he does is, not only does he analyze each of these guys and ask the sort of questions I think are important, political theory, religious theory, etc., he also doesn't deal with, in history of political thought, history of economic thought too, the standard thing, you have 3 guys or 5 guys, right? A typical book of history of political thought would be 3 French thinkers, bing, bing, bing. Or 5 great political theorists, Aristotle, Machiavelli. It's sort of like Strauss, except not necessarily assuming they're all great or consistent. Or 5 great thinkers, or in history of economic thought, the Heilbronner approach, for example. Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Marshall, Keynes, let's say 5 guys, 5 economists. I think this is a rotten way of approaching history of thought. First place, all these political thinkers and economic thinkers were involved in movements, almost all of them. They're also doing, when they say anything, they have certain intentions. They use the words in a certain way. They have a certain author's intention. In order to understand their intention, you have to understand who they're talking to, who they're dealing, who their friends are, who their enemies are. In other words, who they're reacting against. In other words, the historical context of what they're saying. Skinner goes into detailed critiques of each of these people. He doesn't slight that, but he also talks about the so-called lesser people. and also who they're reacting against and how the influence spread to one university after the other or to one country after the other. You really got a whole sense of the sweep history. So the political text, the political thought is not just isolated text sitting up there to be worked on, but it's part of the whole sweep of modern history and history of thought. Also, you can't really understand these guys without figuring out who the other people are and who they're reacting against. And secondly, a lot of the so-called lesser people are just as important as the big shots. In fact, in some ways even better, because they're usually pure. Often they take the master's doctrine and build in a consistent framework. On a political level, for example, in American history, you always hear about Jefferson. Well, Jefferson's a great guy, but the Jeffersonians were much better than he was. They were more consistent. And Jefferson was selling out, especially when he was in power. Whereas the Jeffersonians usually didn't. They were usually attacking him for selling out. So when you deal with the leading Jeffersonians, Macon and Randolph and Taylor, etc., you get a much harder core doctrine than you do if you're only dealing with leadership. So anyway, I'm favoring the whole Skinner approach. There's a very good book on Locke, I'm just mentioning somebody here, by Richard Ashcraft, just came out, called Revolutionary Politics and the Two Treatises on Government. And what Ashcraft does, and he's Marxist, that doesn't really affect this method. What he does is he talks about Locke not only as what his thought was, in the context of a revolutionary libertarian struggle which they were engaged in. He and the Leveler, everybody from the Levelers on, shows how he's related, descended directly from the Levelers, from the libertarian dissident group. It also explains why Locke is famous for being a real scaredy cat. In other words, he wrote everything not only anonymously, he kept everything in a locked drawer and so forth and so on. And often considered pathologically. Why is the guy scared? Why was he a scared rabbit? He was a scared rabbit. He was in exile for 10 years of his life. His friends were all being arrested and shot. Had good reason for being scared. At any rate, that's just one aspect of it. My mentor in history, Joseph Dorfman, was something like this in history of American economic thought. Instead of dealing with 3 people or 5 people, he dealt with everybody. I mean, he had everything in there in his 5-volume compilation. He was much better a historian than he was an economist, but because his economics theory wasn't that sound. On the other hand, he really got everything in there. He's got the whole fact before you. So he was really doing the same sort of thing in American thought. I admit, of course, that this means that historians engage in a lot of work. It's much easier to take 3 texts, 3 guys, and just talk about it. It's much more difficult to find who the other people are. But that's the way life is, as Mises once used to say. He used to claim that historians, European historians, should know about 8 languages. And for everybody started blanching there in the seminar. So, well, nobody's forcing you to be an historian if you want to learn 8 languages. At any rate, so I think this is very important to get the so-called lesser people involved in this thing, as well as the 3 or 5 top guys. Okay, getting to the historiography of economic thought. I trust you already read the Cowder articles and my article on scholastic economics, so we're going to have to repeat it, just sort of condense it a little bit. The key thing in the regular historiography, the orthodox historiography of economic thought, starts as follows. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So a bunch of mercantilists running around talking about specific things like should the government keep bullion in the realm, or should we have tariffs, etc., etc. And then 1776, emerging like Athena out of the brow of Zeus or whatever, is Adam Smith. Out of his head creates all modern economics. Free market, economics, the whole business, right? And that's it. Then you have Ricardo, and you have Marx and whatever, sort of somehow deriving from it. Then you have Marshall, or Austrians, whatever, Marshall and Keynes, and that's about it. But anyway, Smith becomes then the originator, to the extent that some of your beloved people here in Washington wear Adam Smith ties. Presumably it's a tribute to the founder of economics, laissez-faire, whatever. This is pure baloney from start to finish, this myth. And this is one of the things, fortunately, Cowder taught. Cowder is one of the first people to mention it. That's his 2 articles. Schumpeter, who wrote a year or 2 after Cowder, was a famous book which really sort of set this thing forth, the History of Economic Analysis. It's unfortunately, Schumpeter did not live to complete it, so it's badly written and even more badly organized, in many ways almost incomprehensible. He's definitely a revisionist in this sense. In other words, he believes that life existed before Adam Smith, economics existed before Adam Smith, and better. Not only existed, but better. In other words, the counter paradigm, I think is the correct one, is what you have is many hundreds, even 1,000 years of sound economic analysis engaged in by the Scholastics from the Middle Ages down through the late the Spanish Scholastics, 16th century, from Aquinas, even before that, down to the late Spanish Scholastics. That's several hundred years. And then a French tradition in the 18th century, continuing then in France and Italy, and in the 18th century leading to a fantastic flowering of economic thought, modern economic thought, Cantillon and Turgot in particular. And you have everything there. You have laissez-faire, much more pure and much more sound than Adam Smith. And as a matter of fact, Turgot, if any of you have read my little pamphlet on it, is really a pre-Austrian in every sense. He's got time preference in there. He's got the bohm-bawerkian theory of capital. He's got the whole business. Fantastic. He's got the law of diminishing returns. He's got the whole schmear. We have this great flowering of economic thought and laissez-faire thought going hand in hand. And then bingo, we have a collapse with Smith. Schumpeter is properly acidulous about Smith. You read between the lines in particular. Schumpeter obviously is a total contempt for Smith, and for good reason. And he hates Ricardo. It's another great thing. I mean, the hatred of Ricardo shines through the book. It's almost a major feature of the book. It pops up every 50 or 100 pages. Oddly, but Schumpeter is, first of all, it's kind of bizarre. He likes John Stuart Mill for some obscure reason which we can't figure out. Just Mill's only bringing back Ricardo. So anyway, you can't look for much consistency in Schumpeter, but the fundamental paradigm is consistent. Namely, it was a big blow when it came out. Orthodox economists, historians of thought were shattered about a Schumpeter book. We go back and read Frank Knight's, for example, review of it. Couldn't understand why is he pro-Catholic? And of course, Knight, if you know about Knight, was a hysterical anti-Christian. I mean, literally went ape on the Christian's question, Protestant and Catholic, particularly Catholic. So he was not exactly equipped to be very objective about this when it came out. But Knight used to do, when he taught his course in graduate economics, if there were any nuns or priests in the class, he'd just insult the Catholic Church until they left. Then he'd say, now we can begin. Really a weird duck. So I commend Cowder, a marvelous statement on Cowder when he says about Smith and making waste and rubbish of 2,000 years of economic thought. I'll get into that. Anyway, the Cowder thesis on scholastic economics basically is that the scholastics emphasize utility and scarcity as the key determinants of value and of production or whatever. By the way, the neoclassical smear against the Austrians is they're only interested in utility or demand and not supply. This, of course, is rubbish. The whole point is, as you know, you have if you put in the familiar two-dimensional diagrams, you have quantity of a good on the x-axis, and then you have utility or whatever on the y-axis in some way, even though it's ordinal, not cardinal, in some way. Be very broad about it. Simply what we're saying is there's diminishing utility of the good, and the intersection of the demand curve with the supply will bring you the economic value or the price of the product. So it's not that supply is unimportant. What you're really saying is that you have subjective demand, which then impresses itself on the economic system and values everything which is there. All the stuff which is there is being evaluated by people. So you have people doing the evaluating and things out there which are being evaluated. The things are the supply. That's why it's important to have supply as a vertical curve, not to confuse the situation. It's just that Austrians, of course, and the scholastics deny the role of so-called cost in determining price. That was the point. Cost is only affects price by helping determine scarcity. And it gets back to the supply of the product. And as Cowder points out, and Schumpeter points out, and later on, de Roover and Grice Hutchins, a whole bunch of other revisionists on the scholastic front, the entire view that economists had of scholastics for a couple of hundred years is totally all wet. And was the basic view, as I'm sure you've read, is that scholastics believed in the just price. The just price was the cost of production plus a guaranteed profit, or keeping your station in life. Whatever your station is. Of course, if your station is humble, you keep being humble. This is totally all wet. As all these guys have shown, de Roover and all these people shown in detail, very few scholastics had this doctrine, 2 or 3, and these were minor fringe people. The mainstream of scholastic thought was utility, scarcity, and free market. In other words, the just price was the market price. Now, it's true they weren't total libertarians. I'm not going to say that. In the first place, they didn't like the idea of individual bargaining. They thought the market had to be a market. So that if you and I agreed on some price and it's not the market price, they would say that's unjust. And second of all, they were not against price control. They thought the price control could also be just. But that's very far from saying that something else is to replace the market. It was basically they were pro-market people and very keen market analysts. The only thing I want to say about Scholastic personally is one of the best of them, magnificent character, Pierre de Jean Olivier, who wrote about 1400, who was not only a great market analyst and the inventor of sophisticated utility theory, even down to marginal utility theory. He was also an extreme spiritual Franciscan, or rigorous Franciscan, in other words, extreme pro-poverty person. The Franciscan movement started out as pro-poverty, and then with the pledge of poverty, then as the Franciscan church began to accumulate money from donations or whatever, they began to have second thoughts and began to be more realistic about the whole thing. And then the rigorous wing of Franciscan were high of all the you guys are selling out the Franciscan doctrine, Franciscan heritage. And Olivier is the extreme leader, the leader of the Provençal group of extreme pro-poverty people. I mean, he's emaciated. Obviously, since Franciscan, even real Franciscans didn't eat much, more or less the rigorous Franciscans. I mean, very poverty-stricken, sort of like a movie character, very skinny, wandering around. And he was a great, sophisticated market analyst. It's amazing. It's one of the great anomalies in the history of thought. The only thing the Scholastics were weak on was called usury question, the thing which really discredited them eventually. And they had a real problem was they couldn't understand time preference. And after all, nobody until Turgot really understood it. You can't blame them that too much. They couldn't understand why you should charge interest on a riskless loan. And they understood about profit, they understood about opportunity cost, they got the whole thing down. Just the time preference was their major weakness. Even with that, however, the Scholastics managed to sophisticate the whole thing, and they just avoid the whole business with brilliant maneuvering to allow usury anyway. But the brilliant maneuvering, of course, was evasive and therefore was open to attack. The other counter thesis is that it's not an accident. This, when I first read this, I thought it was very interesting but speculative. I now think there's a lot to it. I think, getting deeper into it, that it seems to me no accident that the only labor theory of value of people, in other words, in the history of thought, you have 1,000 years of scholastics, or several hundred years of consumption theorists and utility theorists. All of a sudden, the labor theory pops up. According to the counter, it's no accident that the Calvinists, it's only among Calvinists that labor theory of value flourished. Calvinists believing in the divine obligation for labor. In other words, almost labor is an end in itself. Whereas Catholic thinkers tend to be in favor of consumption, moderate enjoyment, and labor as a means to an end, which is more or less the economic way of looking at it, so to speak. Whereas the Calvinists tend to be anti-enjoyment and want to keep consumption limited to a minimum, really to fuel your continuing labor. I'm not saying every Calvinist is like this or every Catholic, but I think as a broad summary, I think it's pretty accurate. If you look, for example, in Scotland, we have Catholics and Calvinists living side by side. Catholics are always attacking the Calvinists for being dour, standoffish, unfriendly, etc., etc. And the Calvinists are attacking Catholics for being lazy, shiftless, drink a lot. They're probably both right, anyway. But the thing is, that's the sort of difference you get. This seems to hold through throughout. Catholics tend to be much more relaxed, so to speak. As we'll see, the first real labor theory of value person was really Adam Smith. It was not John Locke. I denied it was John Locke. I think Locke had a labor theory of property, which is very, very different from labor theory of value. It simply means, how do you get unowned resources into private ownership? What way to do it? And he was, of course, a homestead theorist. Mixing your labor with the soil, you then becomes your private property. I don't think that's a labor theory of value at all. I think it's a total misconception by historians, of course, get the whole thing mixed up. Of course, we know about natural law in Catholicism versus absolutism. I'll go into that a bit. The natural law tradition, the Aristotelian Stoic tradition, which is then picked up by Aquinas and the Scholastics, especially after Aristotle was rediscovered, means that man, by use of reason, can discover natural laws of reality, which include laws of ethics, and which also put a firm limit on the state. In other words, the state may not invade the sphere of rights or sphere of each individual. I think in addition to that, so that's one sense in which Catholicism had a firm check on state power throughout the Middle Ages and later. And the other, I think, important thing is that the Catholic Church was a transnational check on state rule. I don't want to go out on a limb, but I think it's the only case in history where the church and state were not the same. In other words, in most civilizations, church and state were fused together. You had a mighty rule, a mighty alliance of throne and altar, as the conservatives like to put it. In other words, you have the king, and the king is taxing people, etc. And you have the church, and the church is telling people to obey the king, and of course getting part of the loot, and getting a good chunk of the loot. You have state and church oppressing the public, taxing and controlling, etc., etc. And most intellectuals throughout history have been churchmen. The idea of a lay intellectual comes in only the last couple hundred years. When you have a fusion of state and church, you have a very powerful instrument for despotism and state power. I think this is the only case in history where the state and church were separate. In other words, where the Catholic Church was transnational, and therefore kept a severe limit on the power of each king. As a matter of fact, particularly, and I here, by the way, recommend a marvelous little book by Jean Beckler, a French economic historian, called The Origins of Capitalism. Why did capitalism arise only in Western Europe? Obviously, there's been trade in every civilization, but real capitalism, really market phenomena, etc., really comes in only in Western Europe. And what is it that made it so? And he essentially pinpoints the fact that power was decentralized, was feudalist, of course, instead of being central empire, central despotism. So each power is limited. You have independent principalities, you have villages which had autonomous power in many senses, and feudal landlords had autonomous power. And you have the transnational church to check the individual state. So you have very little state power either externally or internally as a result of these checks, which allowed the market to flourish. As a matter of fact, there's a marvelous phrase here. He says, Beckler says, the expansion of capitalism owes its origins and its raison d'etre to political anarchy. The expansion of capitalism owes its origins and its raison d'etre to political anarchy. And particularly, it's no coincidence, according to Beckler, that the real expansion of capitalism comes in the 11th century, the so-called Renaissance of the 11th century, which coincides with Gregory VII's magnificent smashing of the power of the state for investiture, the power of the king. Well, the kings, of course, are always trying to grab religious power. So then with the Protestant Reformation, all this more or less comes to an end. In other words, first place, many of the Protestant churches become state churches. The Anglican Church, of course, being a total state church. Calvinists, usually what happens is that religious groups tend to be in favor of tyranny when they're in the majority, in favor of religious freedom when they're in a minority. And so, for the Calvinists, it's the same thing. When they took over in Geneva or in Massachusetts, they were pretty rigorous, smashing sin. Whereas when they're in a minority, of course, they became quite libertarian. They evolved into libertarian conclusions. And the thing is, so in the Catholic countries, even there you had a slippage, as the church itself lost a lot of influence. In France, in particular, the growth of absolutism, tremendous growth of absolutism, of course, reaching a peak with Louis XIV in the late 17th century and continuing on until the French Revolution. What happens in France was you had two groups. The Calvinists were very much against the establishment, the state tyranny, and the Catholic leaguers, the extreme Catholics, were also against it. And what happened, they had a series of sort of rebellions and battles, but both the extreme Catholics and the Calvinists coming up with great libertarian political theory in the course of it. What happens is the centrists take over is usually often what happens. It's called the politiques, who historians have called moderate. They're only moderate in the sense they weren't in favor of religions killing each other because they didn't care that much about religion. That's essentially why. But they were not moderate in the sense they want a total state power, a total power of the king, and forget about religion. Well, religion becomes an instrument of the king. And so with the politics winning over, and then you have, in France, the Catholic Church gets under the influence of a crypto-Calvinist group called the Jansenists, who were really Calvinists in sheep's clothing, so to speak, and really take over the French church. And they're very pro-absolutist. Yes, the king is right in all things, etc. And so that was one of the reasons why the Catholic Church did not limit the growth of French absolutism. And then also you had another complication. In Protestant countries, you had scholastics. Hugo Grotius was sort of a free market type. It was a Dutch Calvinist, not really, Dutch Protestant, I should say, scholastic. And Scotland influenced Scotland, and the Scottish Enlightenment, which of course leads to Adam Smith, was also scholastic, Protestant scholastic, or neo-Calvinist scholastic. It becomes complex, but that's basically it. Well, Grotius was in the Arminian camp, in the free will camp in Holland. While we're dealing with, by the way, one of the things about natural law, I should say, in addition to setting up a sphere for individual rights and limiting the government, it also sets limits. In other words, if you really believe in natural law, you believe there are natural limits to man's omnipotence, or any individual's omnipotence. If you don't believe in natural law, anything goes. You can do anything. You can conquer the world and whatever without any ill consequence. That's another reason I think why natural law is important. I just want to mention absolutist thought in Anglican England, Tudor and Stuart, 16th, 17th century Anglican England. Of course, the British church, Anglican church, was a straight state church. They worked out the so-called correspondence theory. It's one of the more bizarre theories in my experience for absolutism. Sir Robert Filmer, who was attacked by Locke, is a beautiful example of this. Theory is called by analogy or by correspondence, the argument by correspondence. Namely, You have a hierarchy of power throughout the world. God, the angels, men, and critters. I say critters. Animals, things like that. Animals, vegetables, whatever, right? So this is the power. God is top power, and then the others are subordinated, each one subordinated to the other, okay? In the same way, and I get this little axiom there, each individual has a head, which runs things, and a heart, and limbs, and all that. And the head is ruling the others. And see, the idea of man rebelling against God, of course, is evil and sinful and impossible, etc. And the same way the idea of limbs or heart rebelling against the head is equally sinful and impossible. Then you have in the family, inside the family, same thing, the father, of course, so the godlike, head-like figure, the mother or the wife, and the kids, of course, subordinate. Notice the social and political implications of all this. And then, of course, with the state, the king, similarly all-powerful nobles, middle class, serfs, etc., foreigners, whatever. So this is the this is the big argument for royal absolutism. It's not an argument most of us find convincing, compelling. And the right-wing Roshians, the Two Circle, the guys known as the Two Circle, had a view of consent. Everybody had consent. Everybody had natural rights of consent and so forth and so on, absolute rights, except some shadowy time in history they surrendered all these rights to the king in perpetuity, and they can't get it back. That was the Two Circles argument for absolutism. The Filmer said, no, that's a sellout. Once you start with rights and consent, you're on a slippery slope that leads directly to anarchism. And in a sense, he was right. Hobbes was a moderate compared to the Two Circle. Hobbes was a liberal deviationist from the Two Circle. He believed that, yes, everybody surrendered all their rights to the king in order to keep the peace, etc. But if the king is really coming at you with a gun and just about to shoot you, you have the right to run away. That was this one concession of right. Of course, the Two Circle says, you have no right to run away. You should bear your bakken, the king's assault. And then, of course, there's the libertarians, or the classical liberals, or levelers and Locke, etc., who are essentially either Calvinists or Protestant independents. We've talked a lot about religion so far, but so far it's been fairly familiar, the labor theory of value, utility and scarcity, and natural law. Now I'm coming to another part which is not as familiar. Other aspects of religion and theology which are also extremely important. I want to mention the thing in Newsweek last week, timid text, short shrift for religion. They talk about high school texts or grade school texts in history, world history, American history. Religion has dropped out. For example, one world culture text for sixth graders manages to discuss Joan of Arc without mentioning God, religion, or her canonization. In other words, 20 pages on Tanzania, but none on the Protestant Reformation. And here's all religions dropped out. A friend of mine is writing a college text of readings in medieval ancient history and modern history. They can't put anything about religion in it. It's not a question of being for religion or against it. Anything about it is considered controversial, and therefore it's to be killed. The whole thing is absolutely bizarre because religion has influenced all of thought and all of action, at least until the 19th century and probably until the 20th. And so when you're talking about the history of anything, especially the history of thought, to leave religion out, to leave most of the stuff out. To leave the values and the ideals that motivate them. It's really crazy. You don't have to be pro-religion or pro-Christianity to realize this has been extremely important, and not to talk about it, but absurd. Now, I'm not a theologian. I don't want to get into theology per se, but I must say I find theology fascinating because it's sort of a deductive system, something like praxeology. Except, of course, the axioms are different. But once you have the axioms, you can spin almost the whole thing out. And you can talk about coherent deductive systems versus incoherent, I think. Anyway, the two things I want to talk about, which are very obscure, seemingly not important, but I think very vital, the history of thought and economic thought, are two things which get left out, even by people who know about natural law and absolutism and all that. One is creatology, or the science, using science in the sense of wisdom, not physical measurement, science of the creation of the universe. Why did God create the universe, in other words? Seemingly, to some of us, a seemingly trivial question, actually pregnant with fantastic political implications. In other words, one slight difference in axioms, there's another thing about theology, deductive system. One seemingly unimportant difference in the axiom can cause tremendous differences in political conclusions or social conclusions. Why did God create the universe? In both of these areas, by the way, and creatology and the other one, my conclusion is purely as a layman, but the Orthodox Christian position is the safest, let's put it that way. creatology, eschatology, namely the science of the last days. How will the world come to an end and when? And the creatology, the science of the first days. This might seem to some people, some secularists, irrelevant. But it's not irrelevant at all. It's extremely important. But before I get to that, I just want to say what actually relates to the creatology, and particularly creatology. One of the key things which Christianity brought to the world, I believe, more than any other religion, is individualism, of the supreme importance of the individual. And I think that's the individual stamped in the image of God, but his or her salvation becomes of extreme importance, and moral choices and all the rest of it. The Greeks, even though I revere the Greeks, they're great rationalists and all that, the Greeks are polis-oriented. So that what they care about is not the individual, but the polis, the state community, the city-state. And so when Plato and Aristotle are talking about virtue and what the virtuous life is, they're talking about the life through the city-state, not for each individual. They don't care about the individual. It's the city-state that counts. So it's a collectivist doctrine to the city-state. Now some of my friends like Doug Rasmussen, some neo-Aristotelians, are trying to claim that they really meant the community and not the state, but I doubt this. I have to be shown this in detail, but I really think this is a city-state. Also, not unrelated to the fact that most of these guys were slave owners. And slavery was, of course, guaranteed by the city-state. In other words, if you're a part of a small slave-owning caste, you got plenty of time to discuss philosophy, for example, because the slaves are doing all the work. And a small number, only the slaveholders voted, and so forth and so on. You tend to identify yourself with the polis, because the polis is you and 500 other guys or 1,000 other guys. So it becomes understandable why they slipped into this collectivist mode. And then other parts of creatology we'll see is species-oriented, which is even more collectivist. Man as a species, or collective species, rather than as an individual. So I think Christianity is unique in bringing the individual into focus as a key element of concern and of moral choice and salvation and all the rest of it. I think it's magnificent, and I think it could not be overstressed. Creatology, seemingly obscure or unimportant. The Orthodox Christian position is that God created the universe out of pure love. God is perfect, almost by definition. Created the universe out of pure love, and that's it. Say the safest approach, whether it's correct or not, I leave to theologians. Certainly the safest approach. The other approach, I don't know what to call it. I haven't found a name for you. I'll just call it the mystical approach. This is the Orthodox Christian approach. The mystical approach is that God created the universe out of felt need, out of what Mises would have called felt uneasiness. God was lonesome, right? God was imperfect and needed creation of the universe. So what are the implications of this? The implications are that the way this works in the picture is that at the beginning, God and man were united. It's very difficult for me to make sense out of this. I'm trying my best. God and man were united in the sense that they were fused together. There was no man. Obviously, man hadn't been created yet, but in some sense they were united. So they had unity. But God was imperfect. Then God creates man, and this is important, it's progressive, because God then can develop his perfection, and man can develop his perfection. In other words, God and man are both imperfect. So, man imperfect. Notice this is man as a species, because each individual dies pretty soon. So we're talking about a collectivist man as species. Collectivist. Man is imperfect, God is imperfect, and human history is a process by which God and man develop, become more and more perfect. So this is good. There's also a bad side to this. The bad side is man is now separated from God for the first time. Alienated. And this, my friends, is the whole origin of the famous word alienation, which I am sick of if you aren't. This is what alienation is. Alienation does not mean feeling unhappy. It does not mean you don't like the state, you don't like your parents. Alienation for these guys means the fundamental separation from God, with whom we had previously been united. We, in a collectivist sense, obviously I wasn't united with God 20 million years ago, whenever it was. Fundamental alienation is the bad part, and the good part is the development. Then finally, so we start off with this unity, and then we have a separation, alienation, and then we have the culmination of history will be, and here we get, of course, in eschatology, will be a reunion of man and God, and a one great mighty climactic reunion, which will be the perfection of man and the perfection of God also. Reunion of man as a species. The individual is nothing. Individual people are just atoms in this whole thing. So man and God will be united in some cataclysmic species species unity, each individual will also be united with every other individual, one blob. It's one species blob, which will also be united with God as one mighty species blob. And this will be the end of history. History will come to an end. This is also eschatology, too, obviously. So this is collectivist, and it means that God is working through history. History becomes an important process by which these things are happening. Also, you start here, then have the Germans call Aufhebung, another word which I'm sick of already. Aufhebung meaning transformation or negation, the famous Hegelian Marxoid word. Aufhebung meaning one stage somehow magically is transformed into another one, and this alienation, and then finally we have the culmination. It's always three, by the way. Three is a key. 3 stages. There's always 3 stages. And the third stage will be a mighty, fantastic one. Everybody, the blobs are united to each other. There's a great phrase. I can't refrain from reading this. One of my favorite writers of all time is G.K. Chesterton. And he's talking about the social theory of Anne Besant, who was a Fabian and theosophist, from, of course, an Orthodox Catholic position of this mystical theosophist viewpoint, where all individuals are blobbed in to each other, and you have the final super blob. So this is the alienation. This is the dialectic. This is the famous dialectic where one stage of history is transformed, magically transformed into its opposite, into something very different, and finally transformed into the final climactic. Now, some of the big shots. One of the things, by the way, about this is, of course, the problem of evil is solved. The problem of evil, of course, as you all know, is the problem, if God is good and omnipotent, how come you have evil in the world? Okay, this is of course, a famous theological problem. By the way, my favorite solution to this is an unorthodox one by H.L. Mencken, who's also my favorite writer. Mencken said that, well, God was created by a committee of gods, each of whom are omnipotent and benevolent, but they just being a committee, they screwed up. It was extremely charming doctrine. One thing it does is that several different solutions for the problem of evil. In other words, the Orthodox Christian solution is that man is created, individuals are created with free will who are free to either choose good or evil. But this solution says, the mystical solution, there is no evil. All seeming evil is really part of a good process, the process of the dialectic, which ends up in a mighty blob, fusion of the blobs. There's no evil in the world because it's all taken care of. Anything that happens is part of the inevitable process, or inevitable. They said sort of like a whig theory in some crazy way. And it winds up with the final fusion, and all processes are inevitable lead to that. Now, some of the big shots in here, Plotinus was probably the first one, a 3rd century Roman Platonist, a sort of Neo-Platonist, and then Christians take this up, or Christian Platonist, a Christian follower of Plotinus. Another big name in this is John Scotus Erigena. By the way, if you want to get more on this, there's a marvelous book, of course, by Leszek Kolakowski called Main Currents of Marxism, which is the first volume which deals with the philosophic roots of Marxism. A Polish immigrant in England. John Scotus Erigena, who was a Scotch-Irish late 9th century philosopher living in Paris, and a famous Christian mystic of the 13th century, Meister Johannes Eckhart. So these are some of the big names in this development of mystical thought of this sort. And then Hegel. I'm not going to go first of all, I haven't finished my study of Hegel from my book. Second of all, one thing I'm not going to go into is Hegel at any great length, but Hegelianism really develops this with Hegel himself becoming God. In other words, God becoming God integrates with Hegel at the end of history. At the end of the dialectic, is God and Hegel fusing. Hegel, becoming, obviously, I just think he's a nut, let's face it. At any rate, there have been, of course, a lot of Hegelians in the world, and still are. Just one quote from Hegel, which I think is charming here, enlightening. He loved Napoleon. He saw Napoleon riding down the street. It's after Napoleon's victories in Prussia. He writes a friend of his, he says, I saw Napoleon, the soul of the world, riding through town. It is indeed a wonderful sight to see, concentrated in a point, sitting on a horse. An individual overruns the world and masters it. Now, what Hegel called world historical figures, who, of course, move history. And Hegel felt that the dialectic of history was ending in his own, since he was the big shot philosopher for the new Prussian state, professor of philosophy at the University of Berlin, the newly created state university, and therefore that's it. He's sort of like the end of history. Eschatology, the science of the final days. Orthodox Christian viewpoint, developed by St. Augustine and still followed by Catholics, Lutherans, etc. Obviously Christianity is messianic. Jesus will return in Second Advent and put an end to history. That's accepted by everybody. The question is in what sense or what form? Particularly, what about the millennium, as is mentioned in the Bible? In other words, what about 1,000 years of the kingdom of God on earth? Where does that fit in? Of course, when Jesus comes as the day of judgment, history is over. The amillennialist, the Orthodox Christian position, from St. Augustine on, is the millennium is simply a metaphor for the Christian church. And that's it. So there's no real kingdom of God on earth in any more concrete sense. And Jesus will return in the second advent at some time, at his own time, and put an end to history, and that's it. So you forget about the millennium, in other words. Millennium sort of drops out as an object of political concern. The millennium is out of politics, and individual salvation becomes the important thing. So history does not become a process of where the millennium is organized, so to speak. In other words, the millennium is outside of history. There are two other wings. Of course, there are many sub-variants within each wing. Two other wings which disagree with us. One is the so-called premillennialist, namely that Jesus will return and establish the kingdom of God on earth for 1,000 years and then put an end to history. So you have pre, in the sense, this is Jesus before the millennium. So history then is a process by which the 1,000-year kingdom will be established in some way. The books of the Bible which are particularly interesting in this are the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are particularly focuses for these people. Every time the premillennialists usually look for signs of the Advent, and there were signs of the Armageddon and the millennium. When Jesus returns, before the millennium is established, lots of problems, a lot of hectic, 7 years of hectic stuff going down, so to speak, wars and all that sort of thing, conflicts. So the premillennialists usually look for signs of this developing, usually in times of turmoil, war, etc. They will pop up and say, aha, the millennium is, Jesus is about to return. During the Reformation, the 17th century wars, and the French Revolution were some outcroppings of the premillennialists. The problem politically was, they're looking for signs. The signs are things like the beast, the dragon, the scarlet woman, the return of the Jews to Palestine, and their conversion to Christianity, etc., etc. Who the beast is for exegesis for people more learned than I am in these matters. But the thing is that all of these people were committed to certain dates. There's the timetable of prophecy. So Isaac Newton, for example, thought that physics was relatively unimportant. His real contribution was trying to figure out how old the world is and when it will come to an end by biblical exegesis. So looking for signs, and usually picking specific dates, the most famous of which were the Millerites, who were very popular in England in the 1840s. And one historian speculates that this influenced Marx, and I'm not sure, there's no evidence for this, but certainly around at the time. In other words, the Millerites said that Jesus will return on October 22nd, 1844, period. Of course, the problem with specific predictions of this sort is very much like economic forecasting, right? What do you do when October 23rd comes around? There ain't no second advent. Now, that's the big problem for prophets of this sort. And so Millerism became discredited. Usually what they do is they say, oh, sorry, my calculations are slightly off. It's really 1864 or something like that. But basically the Millerites went to, sort of had it. And it was succeeded by a new theory, which established essentially current, what's known as fundamentalism now, premillennial fundamentalism, the theory of dispensationalism, invented by John Nelson Darby, the English pre-mill, which is that, the thing is you can't have this timetable. The timetable stops when the Christian church is established. Christian church, as they call it, is a big parenthesis. And so the prophecies of the timetable stops and will only resume at some date which might be soon, but we don't know. So this gets them off the hook, so to speak. You don't have to predict a specific date, but they're still looking for signs. Now, politically, the pre-mills are not that important, except there's always a problem that if you think Armageddon, the great war between good and evil, is about to arrive, you might be tempted to try to speed it up a bit. And, if your finger is near the nuclear button and you're a premillennial, you might be tempted to sort of speed the timetable along. Outside of that, there's not too much political implications for this. So we get to the post-millennialists that we get the political implication of post-mills believe that man has to establish the kingdom of God on earth first in order for Jesus to arrive. Key difference, right? In other words, this is essentially, here you don't worry about the millennium, the amillennialists. Here you get Jesus establishing, although you have various assistants for a cadre. As a matter of fact, the dominant view of the pre-trib, the question is, when does the trib come? The 7 years of heartache, the tribulation. The orthodox view among premillennialists is that Jesus arrived just before the trib and raptures up all the good guys to heaven, but they can just stand alone with Jesus and see the jerks being slaughtered down below, and then return after the Armageddon to establish the kingdom of God on earth. This is the orthodox pre-tribute. There are many mid-tribbers and post-trib. I hate to be a post-tribber. You're in for a bad time. You have the trib first, and then Jesus comes with it. The post-mills believe that man has to establish 1,000 years of kingdom of God on earth first in order for Jesus to return. This places on man a heavy theological responsibility. And almost always, not in every case, but in most cases historically, premills have been raging status because the government is a shortcut. So you have to, in other words, if Jesus comes and brings on Armageddon, then the bad guys are slaughtered in Armageddon. But if man has to establish the kingdom of God on earth first, it means the bad guys have to be some way eliminated by human means. Either by slaughtering the bad guys, is one version, or else gradually by the government sort of stifling them, another version. But at any rate, the post-mills almost always turn to the state to be the great instrument of bringing on a kingdom of God on earth, and this is where it becomes extremely important. I think basically, I believe that Erich Voegelin is a famous Christian political theorist who died recently. He was a Austrian, Swiss, I think, originally. But at any rate, he was also a student of Mises' seminar, anything that means. But Voegelin's turgid writings, his basic theme was, his guiding theme was, don't immanentize the eschaton. This is a very complex way of saying, I think, something very important. Don't immanentize the eschaton. Sort of a Germanic way of saying something important. Namely, if you bring eschatology, in other words, if you bring the millennium into human history, you're in trouble. The Orthodox Christian view, amillennialist view, is the last days, kingdom of God or whatever is up in heaven. So you don't worry about it on earth, so to speak. If you bring it down onto earth, you immanentize it, and make it immanent within the earth, within human affairs, within human history, and you have all sorts of problems. You have people trying to stamp out sin by fire and brimstone, etc., etc. And that, I think, is an important insight by Voegelin, despite its sort of jargon formulation. Okay, thank you very much.